To our session this morning, the Million Martian meeting. I am very delighted to be here, and I appreciate you inviting me to moderate your session. So, here are the ground rules. We have a schedule. I recognize that it is a suggestion, but it's a very strong post-hypnotic suggestion. So we're going to, as well as possible, try to stick to it, and I will be the post in your post-hypnotic suggestion. We will try to make sure that we get all of the information out, that we have a good time, and also that we have a productive time. So if you are tweeting during this event, please use hashtag MMM. If you're on Facebook, make sure that you're using the Facebook group that we have. And if you are on MySpace, then my apologies. So, what I'd like to do first is bring up one of the co-founders and the chief executive of the Mars One Corporation, Bas Landstrom.
Thanks, Joe. I'm going to be really brief because, as Joe said, we have a really ambitious schedule, and I would like all the speakers to have as much time as possible, and my time is actually after the break. So, very briefly, for me it's a great pleasure and honor to be here, and I'm very excited to see so many of you here. We all, I think, have the experience that when you tell people, I want to go to Mars, you get some strange reactions, and for us that's really weird because it's very logical that you want to go to Mars. But for a lot of other people, apparently it's not. We have to take that into account. They should also take into account that we might have a different opinion than they do, which is sometimes difficult for people. But it's a great pleasure to be here with people when you say, hey, I want to go to Mars. They say, yeah, well, me too. So I'm really excited. I think it's great that so many of you drove here, flew here. I'm really honored. Thank you very much for being here, and I'm looking forward to a really exciting event. And a special thanks for the guys that organized this. Maybe we can give them a little round of applause. Thanks a lot, and I'll give the floor back to Joe, who will introduce the first speaker. Thanks a lot, guys.
And without further ado, our first speaker needs no introduction outside of this room, but since we're hoping that people not in this room will be joining us via live stream, Twitter, and Facebook, I'm going to introduce Mr. Robert Zubrin. Robert is an aerospace engineer and author best known for his advocacy of manned exploration to Mars. He was the driving force behind Mars Direct, a proposal intended to produce significant reductions in the cost and complexity of such a mission. The key idea was to use the Martian atmosphere to produce oxygen, water, and rocket propellant for the surface stay and return journey. A modified version of the plan was subsequently adopted by NASA as their design reference mission. He questions the delay and cost-to-benefit ratio of first establishing a base or outpost on an asteroid or another Apollo program-like return to the moon, as neither would be able to produce all of its own oxygen, water, or energy. Those resources are producible on Mars, and he expects people would be there thereafter. So obviously, he's a very shy person, so please give him a warm round of applause as we welcome Mr. Robert Zubrin.
I'd like to thank Mars One for inviting me to address this meeting and for what it and what all of you are doing. Because I think this is the most important thing going on in the world today. Humans are not really native to the Earth. We're native to Kenya. That's why we have these long, thin arms with no fur on them. We are actually tropical animals. That is our natural habitat. And for the first 150,000 years of the existence of Homo sapiens as a species, that is where we live, pretty much the Kenyan Rift Valley. But then, for various reasons that are not completely understood, around 50,000 years ago, humans started to migrate out of there. And by humans in the sense, I mean Homo sapiens, which is the kind of human that all people on the planet are today. And colonized Africa, Europe, Asia, and then eventually Australia and the Americas as well. And we became a global species. Now, we only did this by means of technology. No untechnological human could survive a single winter night in Colorado, where I live. It requires technologies like fire, clothing, houses, to survive even a night. And to survive for any length of time would require all kinds of skills. And that are not instinctual, but represent culture. And that is how we became a global species. And on the basis of that, instead of being just a few tribes in the Kenyan Rift Valley, we became a global species with hundreds of countries, hundreds of cultures, a vastly rich tapestry of history, innumerable technological inventions contributed by various cultures in various ways, both based on the diverse environments they had to deal with and the diverse cultures and outlooks that they developed that gave them certain approaches to problems. And there's absolutely no question that humanity today and the history of humanity up till this point represents a vastly rich tapestry of experience than would have been remotely possible had we remained a few tribes in the Kenyan Rift Valley. And in fact, it's unlikely that we would have even survived to this time. Certainly questionable if we had remained a local species rather than a global species. Well, right now, we have the prospect of taking this to the next step, of breaking out of the planet Earth and going from a global species to a multi-planet spacefaring species. And I must say in this connection that while I am absolutely of the belief that Mars is the critical first step in this process, and it must be the focus for our time, it is just the first step in this process. And that if we do what we can do in our time and establish that first Plymouth Rock settlement on Mars, then 200 years from now, there will be new branches of human civilization on Mars and outposts going much further out. And 500 years from now, there will be new branches of human civilization, not merely on Mars and on asteroids and so forth, but on thousands of planets orbiting thousands of stars in this ring of the galaxy. Okay? And we will have expanded the human story and the human experience to an extent as great and as significant as expanding out of the Kenyan Rift Valley to a global species represents in terms of our prior history. And, you know, a few years ago, some fellow, an alleged philosopher, wrote a book called The End of History, in which he said that and his book was written in the mid-90s or so, following the collapse of the Soviet bloc, and so there it is. History had ended. There's really not much else that's going to happen from here on out. And I don't think we've reached the end of history. I think that this time will be looked at as the beginning of history. This time will be remembered because this is when humanity first set sail for other worlds. And similarly, you know, I take it most of you are Americans, and if you ask any American what happened in the year 1492, virtually any of them will tell you, well, that's when Columbus set sail for America. And of course that's correct, but that is certainly not the only thing that happened in 1492. In 1492, the Borgias took over the papacy, the most important, or apparently important political institution in the world at the time. In 1492, Lorenzo de' Medici died. In 1492, England and France signed a peace treaty. So there were all sorts of things that happened in 1492 that if there had been newspapers then, would have been the headlines and the dominant, subject of discussion for the TV talking heads on the evening shows, rather than this somewhat marginal development of this Italian weaver's son taking 3 ships and sailing off in some odd direction. But yet, that is what we remember, and only history buffs remember the other stuff. And similarly, 500 years from now, what people are going to remember of this time is what we did to make their multi-planet, spacefaring, interstellar civilization possible. They won't know or care who came out on top in Iraq. Most of them probably will have never heard of Iraq. Or Afghanistan, or whether the health plan went through or didn't, or who was in and who was out, and who got elected mayor of New York. But what we did to make them possible. And so this is the first step. Now, why is Mars the first step of the beginning of history? Okay? Because it is the closest planet that has on it all the resources needed to support life and therefore technological civilization. I mean, the other direction that is sometimes cited is potentially the moon, but Mars compares to the moon for the coming age of human exploration and expansion as Greenland compared to North America in the previous one. Greenland was closer to Europe. Europeans did reach it first. But it was simply not a place that was rich enough in resources and potential to develop a true branch of human civilization, whereas North America was. And by extending human civilization, in particular Western civilization, to North America, and creating this very new dynamic branch, it created this new society, introduced democracy in the sense that it's currently understood, and invented telegraphs and electric lights and aeroplanes and nuclear power and computers and the internet and all this stuff, and has revolutionized human existence. So Mars has got the resource, so we just comparing it. There is water on the moon in parts per million quantities, except at the poles in certain shadow craters at at 40 Kelvin. Whereas Mars, there's continent-sized regions on Mars that are 60% water by weight in the soil. And even at the equator, the soil is 5% water. And for instance, at my company, we've built machines that can bake water out of the soil at 5% concentration and blow it out with CO2 gas and condense it and so forth. Mars has got a carbon dioxide atmosphere. Carbon, of course, is the key element for life. Carbon and water is where it's at. Moon has no carbon. There's nitrogen on Mars, the next element of importance to life. It's the minority constituent in the atmosphere. There's no nitrogen on the moon. Mars has all the elements necessary for industry. The moon is lacking about half of them. And furthermore, the elements on Mars have been concentrated because, you see, on Mars you have geological processes like water action and volcanism and perhaps even biology that are responsible for taking diffuse elements and turning them into concentrated mineral ore. You know, geochemically speaking, copper is one of the rarest elements on the Earth. And yet, human societies have used copper since the late Neolithic period. It's been an important material. And how is that possible? It's because we have natural processes on Earth that have concentrated copper into copper ore and even metallic copper, so that societies with very limited technological potential have been able to make use of it. And that's what you need. On the moon, everything is basically trash rock. Mars also has a 24-hour day, which is what is necessary to grow plants. And furthermore, it has an atmosphere which, as thin as it is thick enough to mask out solar flares. Solar flares can be masked out or at least reduced to non-lethal doses by about 5 inches of water shielding. Now, if you're on the surface of Mars and you're looking straight up to the zenith, is about the CO2 between you and space is equivalent to about 8 inches of water. But which is more than what we have in a solar flare storm shelter on a spacecraft. But if you actually average it out over the 2 pi steradians of the hemisphere above you, that is, most solar flare particles wouldn't come straight down, they'd come in through the atmosphere at an angle, it's equivalent to about 65 centimeters, so 2 feet of water. So you're actually shielded on the surface of Mars against solar flares. Now, what does that mean? That means you can set up greenhouses on the surface of Mars that are unshielded. That is, they're just glass or plastic and sunlight can come in. And that's very important because, okay, at the Martian equator, the solar flux is equivalent to that of Norway on Earth, which is, as you can see, enough to sustain a biosphere. And so there is enough natural sunlight on Mars to grow plants. Now, there's certainly enough sunlight on the Moon to grow plants, except